Going live.
All
Okay,
right.
now we're live. Okay. Um,
Hello,
Hey, everybody.
Midwestern Marks.
Hello, everyone. We're really excited today. Um, I know that Mitch and I, as well as Noah and I, have talked about Professor Rockhill's work for quite some time. So it's a pleasure to have him on today. But we're going to have him on at 3:30. We're waiting for people to roll in. But Mitch, you took a fun trip today as somewhat of a part of a project that you've been leading in our website, which is American Socialism Travels. You want to tell us a bit about that before we get started?
Sure. Yeah. So I went to the Genesee Country Village and Museum. It's sort of like if you've been to like Colonial Williamsburg, it's kind of like that, like step into the past type of thing.
Mm,
But it's focus is on local history, and the buildings. A lot of the buildings were moved there from elsewhere in the area, and they basically picked them up, put them on a truck, and trucked them into this village they created. But um, one of the reasons that I really wanted to go there, I've been there a couple times before, but they have a Shaker administration building there that was part of the community at Groveland. The Shakers, actually, the Fourier Socialists bought the Shaker community in Sodus Bay from them, and the Shakers moved down to Groveland, New York. And today, actually, the site of the Shaker Village there is a prison, is a New York State prison. I was talking to the woman there that about trying to like get in there and look, and she said you have to have permission from the state and everything to go in there, unfortunately now. But they do have the administration building from that village at the Genesee Country Village and Museum, and they have a small Shaker garden where they have the medicinal herbs that Shakers used to grow, and they would also sell them as Shaker cures. They had books of herbal medicine, Shaker cure books. So, and then the other interesting thing that was at the Genesee Country Village was the Octagon House. Was sort of a reform-minded idea of how it was designed. So it's octagonal, and each room has a window in it, or either a window or a door, an opening to the outside. And the idea was so that sunlight could get in, and there could be a cross breeze through the whole house to keep it cool. But the architect that designed it, he had this idea that you could make architecture that was more conducive to the needs of human beings and of life. And so that was sort of an idea that the situationist architects would take on somewhat later. The owners of that place were spiritualists, and actually the man, now I can't remember their names, unfortunately, but the man was actually an anti-Masonic politician. And his brother-in-law was Garrett Smith, the abolitionist. And the wife was a Methodist minister in the 1870s who converted to spiritualism around that time. But unlike many spiritualists, she did not believe in the Fox sisters. Those were the sisters that did what was called the Rochester Rappings in Hydesville. But she saw them as charlatans, and they admitted that themselves. Later on in their life, they said we had a string attached to an apple, and we were like, making the sounds that way. So yeah, but that was really interesting. So those two movements, anti-Masonism and spiritualism, were two of the many radical movements in Western New York at the time. So that Genesee Country Village is has some of the cross sections of many of the radical movements of the burnt over district.
What really interested me and thank you, by the way, Jacob. That bass is a favorite of mine. What really interested me about what you were saying was the Shakers, and I wish I've read more on this. I haven't, but I do know some stories from my grandparents who told me about when the Shakers actually came and ran blockades to deliver supplies to the Red Army during the Civil War after the October Revolution, which I always thought was really cool, and how the utopian socialist sort of Christians in America at the time were wholly supportive of the workers' movement in Russia.
That's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I know that the Shakers numbers increased throughout the 19th century. So the 19 teens would have been their peak, probably in terms of population. So I do know that that they were often visited by secular socialists, who saw them as an example of communism and living. But I didn't know that they actually, intervened in the Russian Civil War stuff. That's really great. The Shakers had relationships with other socialist movements, and so I think that's. But I never heard much about their interfacing with Marxists. So that's really interesting.
A friend of mine actually grew up in Shaker Heights, which obviously is named after them, and I really wish I knew more than just sort of word of mouth stories about this stuff, because like my grandparents telling me stories when I was a kid is not the same as knowing the dates of who went where and when and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's got to be information out there. That would be an interesting research project to look more into.
Add it to the list.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that was my day today, but we're going to talk to Gabriel Rockhill, and I was reading his article last night, and I listened to a couple actually podcast appearances that he did, and this is some pretty explosive stuff, because when I started getting into philosophy, the Frankfurt School was pretty influential on me, and they were pretty influential on my move away from anarchism to Marxism, Leninism. So, well, we'll get into it, but it's pretty explosive. It's pretty controversial. So, very.
I wanted to, when I did the promo vid for this event, I wanted to verbally say an idea for a meme, and I realized that wouldn't have came out nicely, but it's depicted like the Frankfurt School Marxism. It's depicted nicely in the meme where the kid tells his mom, can I have this? And then the mom's like, we have this at home. And it's always like something that's, it's not the same quality. It's like, Mom, I want Marxism. We have Marxism at home. And then you have a picture of a door.
That would be good. I often think about where we are today and sort of how the left is viewed in public by the masses. And I think it's largely influenced by this sort of embryonic form of, the networks of NGOs and think tanks and academia that we have right now, that has sort of taken over how people view Marxism itself. And what interests me is how we've gotten this from the shift from Marxism, Leninism, and the actual theories of Marx and Engels and Lenin to this sort of mystification and distortion to liberalism dressed up in a sort of red mask, And when I first read Professor Rockhill's work, I was blown away too. We all hear about the Congress for Cultural Freedom, but this guy's getting Freedom of Information Act requests. He's digging deep into this and all of the actual genuine connections that created all of this. And it's just fascinating to me and sad how it sort of snowballed into an anti-communist, or what he calls the compatible left. I'm sure we'll get into that more, but it's amazing to me.
I do think it's important to keep in mind, though, I think sometimes people see these things as black and white. I've noticed this with discourse around the New Left and the Weather Underground and SDS and stuff like that. And I think people tend to say it's either totally dominated by feds, and the CIA is completely writing the narrative, or it's totally genuine, it's totally organic, and it's totally revolutionary, you know. And I think we need to avoid that kind of black and white thinking, because, you know, and I'll use SDS as the example because we're going to talk about how this started earlier than that. But in terms of SDS, absolutely they were infiltrated by feds. Absolutely the feds were trying to shift the narrative, you know, towards something that was more compatible with what the State Department and the CIA wanted. Absolutely, there were also committed, genuine revolutionaries who, through their efforts, through their radical organizing efforts, did make a change in society for the good, right? So we shouldn't see it as black or white, you know, because there's internal contradictions within these movements, you know, so which, you know, they can have sometimes both a progressive and reactionary character.
Yeah, one of my questions tries to highlight some of that with the story of Reagan's and his encounter with Norman Thomas, which is not that known of a figure now, but in his day, he was very well known as one of the more prominent American socialists within this left anti-communist camp, of course. But yeah, but we can see it today in like Bernie, right? And the Bernie movement and the Democratic Socialist movement, where it's not one or the other. They're bringing people like, you know, like me, Eddie, and a bunch of people in my generation to socialist politics, and because of their own limitations, they are creating the conditions for us to realize that, you know, they're not it, you know, that Marxism, Leninism is the way forward. Yeah. Let's see.
That's sort of my view of Gabriel Rockhill himself, I think. How he, I mean, we'll talk to him about this, but how he arrived at Marxism, Leninism, going through this is really similar to a lot of us, you know. I'm sort of a unique case, but I hear this story all the time, you know. I got radicalized by Bernie or by the anti-war movement, and I continued searching for what was correct because I'm dedicated to this. And it's really, it's beautiful to watch, honestly.
Mitch, when you interviewed Zizek, were you still in the anarchist phase, or was that the Frankfurt School phase? What phase was that?
Yeah, I would consider myself like a left com at that time. Yeah, I kind of was into like council communism and that idea. So I guess I would say I was trying to find a compatible medium between anarchism and communism, I guess. So.
Yep.
So of course you interviewed Zizek at that time.
Yeah.
He has this really great question about Santa Claus.
I'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had a friend of mine that actually gave me that question, so I can't totally take credit. And I do want to say my friend Joshua Strauss, I got to give him a little bit of a shout out here because he's the one that set that up, that Zizek interview. And that was like a really magical conference. That was so crazy. But that was when I first met Jody Dean, too, who's in the PSL now. So,
cool.
Yeah.
For all his faults theoretically, and I think there's a ton, and politically even more, he does seem like a cool guy to hang out with, right?
Definitely.
I don't know if you're the only one that has hanged out with him or hung out.
He's fun. He makes jokes. You know, he loves to joke. He makes dirty jokes, which sometimes gets him in trouble. But
or gets him canceled or attempted to be canceled.
Yeah, you know. But yeah, he's definitely fun to talk to. Very animated. And my friend Josh, you know, he was asking these bizarre questions that like weren't quite coherent necessarily, but Zizek had an answer. He was like, it was like he could translate his like obscure speech. Like he's that smart. He knew, you know, what my friend was saying, you know, and he had great answers for all the questions, even the bizarre ones. So
I was so into Zizek, and it really fucked me up because I was into him before I had a chance to read a lot of theory. So I started like adapting his mannerisms and the way he wrote, and I didn't know theory, so it just looked foolish, and it was so funny. But
well, also
you mess with your nose just constantly.
And
You know.
Zizek does not write. He doesn't write the way you're supposed to. His organization is all over the place. He goes on tangents, and it's very chaotic the way he writes. So yeah, and so if you're copying his writing style, people are going to be like, "What are you doing?" This doesn't make sense.
I had to take a Zizek fast. That's what I've stayed away from him for like 4 or 5 years, and now I'm like re-engaging with this stuff. But yeah, it's weird how those mechanisms.
I've only read one of his books. It was one on Mao, and I wasn't really that thrilled with it. But some of the talks he's given that I've seen videos of were really good. It's interesting to engage with other sorts of socialists. You know, nothing's ever black and white. You can always learn things from other people.
His old RT articles were pretty good when he was doing mostly cultural analysis. But yeah, politically, he's been consistent for a really long time.
Back when RT wasn't totally right wing too. RT went in a real right wing direction, and they got rid of most of the socialists that were working there. So
I didn't know that. I don't usually
after
go to
Trump,
RT.
after Trump was elected, they went way right wing.
Okay, we have Professor Rockhill in the waiting chat. Let me change the Frankfurt School and the CIA. Really slow. I look at my little sister. She's 12, and she's just like a fucking machine gun. I don't get it, but hello.
Nice to connect with you.
Likewise.
Hello, pleasure to talk to you.
How's the video and audio is okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Just to warn, we are live now.
Great.
Okay, so we can get started. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to have you here. As I mentioned in the pre-live chat, Noah and myself, as well as Mitch and myself, have been talking about your work for quite a while. So to be able to talk to you is quite a pleasure. But I'm going to start by giving a short introduction, the little blurb that you usually use with the articles. But Gabriel Rockhill is a philosopher, cultural critic, and political theorist. He teaches at Villanova University and Graterford Prison, and he directs the critical theory workshop at the Sorbonne. His recent books include Counter History of the Present, published in 2017, Interventions in Contemporary Thought, 2016, and Radical History and the Politics of Art, 2014. You can check him out on Twitter at Gabriel Rockhill, spelled as it is in his name box there. Thanks for coming on, Gabriel.
Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
Sweet. So we can get started right away. Mitch, I think you have the first question.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? And how might your upbringing have led you to an interest in critical theory?
Well, I grew up in Kansas, so Midwestern Mark seems like a good show to be on, and particularly pleased to connect with people in the Midwest who have an orientation that doesn't kind of fall in lockstep with the dominant ideology. I grew up on a farm working construction, and so I think the existential root of my philosophic and political interests and commitments is definitely the experience of super exploitation, and that in kind of maturing through that process, trying to understand the world that I came into, I was attracted to philosophy because I thought that philosophy was something that would give you a kind of broader worldview and allow you to connect the dots between your existential experience and the kind of broader forces, if it be in the social and political world or more generally than that. And but relatively quickly in my studies, I realized that what was on offer within the U.S. Academy, and then I ended up doing a master's and PhD in France. So within the capitalist core, was not exactly the theoretical framework that would allow for a veritable liberation from exploitation and oppression. And so a lot of my work has been done, along the lines of an autodidact, someone who teaches themselves the skills that they need to understand the world that they're living in, because the dominant institutions actually train you in the opposite of that. So I don't know if that's a good opening start, or if I should go into any greater detail in that regard.
I think
but that's the deeper background. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good, because it kind of leads me into the next question that I have, which is that it seems like a central thesis of a lot of your work is this idea of a global theory industry. So I was wondering, how did you develop that theory? And can you explain what is the global theory industry? What's its purpose and power in the real world? And what's critical theory's role in the global theory industry?
That's an excellent question. The way in which I understand the kind of global theory industry is, if we pick up on what I was just saying about my own existential experience, I wanted to, in a very naive manner, because there was a lot of romanticism and, simplistic intellectual opportunism, I think, in my earlier self that hopefully I've purged. And so I was attracted to the people who were presented as being the most intelligent, the smartest, the most cutting edge. And I began by studying that within the US context. But of course, within the US context, the people that I was exposed to, the work that I was exposed to, was the work of the Frankfurt School, French theory, and then the various trendy iterations that have developed out of that, if it be queer theory, decolonial theory, post-colonial theory, Afro-pessimism, etc. And what I began to see after mining deep down into these traditions, because it wasn't a superficial engagement, on the contrary, I studied with Derrida, I did my master's with him, I did a PhD with Badiou, I took classes with a lot of the so-called leading luminaries of French theory, but also many within the German and American traditions. I came to realize that there was a really clear pattern that one is not trained to see within the academy, because you're trained to either do philosophy or political economy or something else. And you're certainly not trained, even within those disciplines, to see the continuities between different schools. Instead, you're trained that, well, they're at lockheads with one another, they completely disagree, and it's either Habermas or Derrida. And you don't see that, well, actually, Habermas and Derrida agree a lot about how the world works. And so in mining down both through the content of their work, but then also through the institutional history of their promotion and the material history of that promotion, the involvement of major US corporations and foundations, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, etc., the involvement of the national security state, both in the US and also in Europe, and as well, the military industrial academic complex in general, I came to realize that, well, the structural pattern isn't just at the level of content, it's at the level of how these ideas are produced and circulated in society more generally. And so this has led me to a kind of deep materialist critical reflection and investigation into the intellectual apparatus. And the intellectual apparatus is not a fancy term, it's actually very simple. What it means is the system that produces ideas. And it produces the people who produce those ideas. And so you have to have an account of that material system of production and not just look at individual thinkers. And that system of production is also embedded within a system of distribution, like what ideas get out there, who gets translated, who's publishing articles supporting the war in the proxy war in Ukraine in The Guardian, if I can make a shout out to the anti-communist intellectual Slavoj Žižek. But it's also about who receives those ideas. And so it's the entire system of production, circulation, and consumption of ideas, which is a really basic kind of materialist approach to culture and to ideology. And so the global theory industry, I think, is a relatively unique phenomenon that emerges in the long 20th century. You see elements of it in the 19th century, but it really becomes consolidated beginning in the interwar period and then in the wake of World War II, because the intellectual apparatus in the capitalist core, which of course has enormous implications globally due to colonialism, neocolonialism, etc., was locked into a battle of ideas that I think is potentially the most important battle of ideas of our lifetime and of the long 20th century. And that is the battle between a set of ideas that have been identified with the historical materialist tradition that are tools for global liberation and that have been used in various ways, sometimes abused, but it's a tool set. It's an unbelievably important tool set because it's not just knowledge, it's knowledge with practical import. It's knowledge that's linked to and embedded within the practical transformation of the world. That is very dangerous knowledge. And so the global theory industry, as it's emerged and developed within the capitalist core, functions principally as a bulwark against the science of human liberation. And that bulwark means that there has to be a set of ideas that are produced, circulated, and consumed that create, and there's many different levels at which this functions, and we can get into some of the details, but in the big picture scenario, one of the things that's crucial for the intellectual apparatus in the capitalist core is to produce the illusion of radical theory that's actually severed from the practical transformation of the social and political world. And so the work that I've been doing on the Frankfurt School, but also on French theory and a lot of other intellectual traditions, I think clearly demonstrates at the material level, even for people who disagree with me, I think they should recognize what the historical record is, that the global theory industry functions as an institutional apparatus that is anti-Marxist through and through, and one of its principal functions is to discredit, delegitimate historical materialist analysis and replace it with what is really a poor ersatz for analysis, or a poor replacement for deep materialist analysis. And these are all of the various forms of radical theory and a shared kind of ideology, which in certain cases amounts to a kind of anarcho-anti-communism, where at best you have people who say, well, I'm against the system, I want to break with the system's bad, but that thing called socialism is much, much worse. So all that we can do is kind of occupy this anarcho-anti-communist position. There's a lot more that could be said about that. Critical theory, because I forgot the tail end of your question. Frankfurt School style critical theory has played an absolutely foundational role in the global theory industry. It emerged in the interwar period and functions in many ways as one of the bedrock elements for all of these later traditions. I mean, if you read the work of Judith Butler, she's engaging with Theodor Adorno. If all of the lineages are actually quite clear as soon as you trace them out, those traditions. And French theory, which emerged much more in the 1960s and 1970s and became prominent in the Anglophone world in the 80s, really became one of the kind of central elements in that larger global theory industry as well. And one maybe final thing that I'll add to that is that the global theory industry also plays an absolutely essential role in trying to redefine the very nature of Marxism. And for anyone who's read the Dictatorship of the Proletariat and the Renegade Kautsky, we know that this doesn't just date from the latter part of the 20th century. There's a deep history of attempts institutionally to purge Marxism of its revolutionary core and make it into one discourse amongst others, make it into a philosophy that we can just compare and contrast, or that we could mix with other philosophies, a little bit of Freud, a little bit of Lacan, a little bit of this, that, and the other thing. And then it becomes a kind of discursive assemblage, right? Rather than a tool set for human liberation. And those are two very, very different things. So I see the global theory industry as playing a central role in the intellectual world war of ideas that has defined much of the long 20th century.
Wow. Thank you so much. That really explains such a great overview of this. What I have a follow-up question for this. You sort of touched on what in your recent piece you called the ABS, right? The anything but socialism theory. What my question is really is in regards to this, how has this sort of superseded Marxism through funding and foundations? Could you name a few of the concrete examples of how this happened and grew out of the Frankfurt School?
Yeah, there's a number of different elements, right? Because the social world is complex and there are different forces that are operative. But I think that the clearest macro view that we can have on these developments is the following. That is that what I was referring to is the intellectual apparatus. So this entire system of production, circulation, and reception of ideas, which includes schools and universities, but also, of course, the media and also culture, right? It's a very expansive notion. And the intellectual apparatus is a central part of the superstructure. And it has material and institutional elements that are essential to it. It's not just free-floating ideas. That one driving force behind this has been the corporatocracy and the capitalist ruling class. In particular, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, Mellon are members of the capitalist ruling class who set up foundations. If you know the deep history of foundations and the way in which they work, they steal wealth from the workers. And then instead of allowing it to be redistributed in some capacity through process of taxation, they steal it a second time. And they redistribute it instead through their foundation circuits to any of the cultural and intellectual projects that they're invested in, right? So this is a very clear case of the capitalist control of cultural production. And when you look at the history of the capitalist ruling class and the type of intellectual work that they've supported, as well as the institutions that they've supported, the pattern is very clear. I'll just throw out a few quick examples. Like, French theory came to the United States, most people claim, in 1966, because there was a famous conference organized at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore that brought, quote unquote, all of the leading luminaries of what was called then French structuralism. So happens that it was funded to the tune of millions of dollars by the Ford Foundation for this conference, and then for follow-up seminars and other projects related to this. There wasn't, with the potential exception of Lucien Goldman, who's a debatable figure, a single Marxist who was invited, because Marxists were persona non grata in the United States. And someone like Althusser, who was clearly a structuralist, couldn't be invited to the United States because he was a member of the French Communist Party, right? And so you have the political framework for the arrival of French theory being basically a triage to keep out historical materialists, combined with the bankrolling of the capitalist ruling class. And as I point out in the most recent article that we've exchanged about briefly prior to this show, the Frankfurt School has a very similar pattern. The Rockefeller Foundation has been involved in supporting the movement of Adorno and Horkheimer back and forth between the US and Europe, as well as supporting the institute itself, the Institute for Social Research, or what is the Frankfurt School, the institution, and its movement back to West Germany, not to East Germany, in the wake of World War II. There are a lot of other good examples of this. In fact, one of the institutions that I studied at in France, the École d'études en sciences sociales, was, it's very well known because Derrida taught there, Barthes, Bourdieu, and others received an enormous amount of funding, also from the US capitalist ruling class, in their bid to leverage institutional power away from the institutions that have been controlled by the Marxists. And so this is a broader international history and expands well beyond the United States, and for that matter, beyond the capitalist core, because you can see elements of it internationally as well. But there's another element to this, and sometimes I found that people who engage with my scholarship don't really understand some of what I'm doing, because they see the reference to the CIA and they think, oh, this guy's watched too many James Bond movies. But the problem is often the people who've read me have watched too many James Bond movies, because they don't really understand how the CIA works. The CIA works, to start with, they're involved in the CIA, in the James Bond movies. And so one of the things that the CIA does is it produces a public image of itself that then people naively embrace, and then they don't understand some of my scholarship because they've already been indoctrinated into the way in which the CIA wants them to think about the world, which is that the Central Intelligence Agency runs all of these, very sophisticated operations with tons of gadgets, and there's a whole logic really to how all of that is packaged. But what they don't do is outline in Mission Impossible or these other films the institutional mechanisms of the Central Intelligence Agency and other agencies, if it be MI6 in Great Britain or other agencies within the United States. And one of the things that's really important for this history is, and one of the metaphors that I use in some of the work that I've done on this, is that a lot of people will think, well, intellectuals, if they have a relationship to the CIA, then it must be that they're marionettes, and that there's just all these strings that are attached and the CIA is up there kind of pulling the strings. The CIA is a very complex and sophisticated organization and set of operations, and they know full well that if there are strings attached, then you can follow the strings back and find out who the marionette is, and you see all the relationships and they're transparent. Granted, that has happened in certain instances, but what has proven to be much more successful is that you build marionette theaters and you allow the marionettes to come of their own free will. And so if you control the intellectual apparatus and you create opportunities for people to become intellectual superstars who are wined and dined on the global junket, and all that they have to do is pronounce, radical critiques that preserve the fundamental border of class struggle. And that's the difference between a radical critique and the support for actually existing socialist projects. And if you don't do that, if you do that and you play according to the rules of the game, then there are enormous opportunities. And so the Congress for Cultural Freedom is a great example of this. It's a front organization for the Central Intelligence Agency. They had offices in 35 countries around the world. They were writing dozens of premier prestige journals in multiple languages, in German and Spanish and English, obviously, and Italian, etc. They were translating work. They were having people circulated around the world. They were running international conferences that aren't small little junkets. They're international conferences with simultaneous translations into dozens, tens, if not dozens of different languages, with press coverage within the mainstream press, with thousands, if not in certain cases, tens of thousands of people attending these conferences. So these are enormous operations, including art festivals and music performances and other such things.
Very expensive.
What's that? Super expensive.
Very expensive, yeah.
Yeah, very, very expensive. And so the Congress for Cultural Freedom is a big part of these operations, and it was repackaged and then funded by the Ford Foundation. It has continued just in different forms later on. So it can't be confused. Like if it's CIA or it's the Ford Foundation, actually there are liaisons between the Ford Foundation and the CIA, and that's how it's always worked. And if you look at the people who've worked at the top echelons of the Ford Foundation and the top echelons of the Central Intelligence Agency, you'll see a lot of continuities. And there's a reason for that. These are the institutional mechanisms of the capitalist ruling class. And just as the university isn't separate from the economic and political world, we can't assume that these foundations are somehow separate from the bourgeois state. So another very important organization in this regard, and then I'll stop because there's I feel like I'm getting too far into some of the other material that we might discuss, is the Information Research Department that was set up in Great Britain, which is, to a certain extent, it was the predecessor to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. But again, this was an enormous operation with, 400 to 500 full-time propagandists whose role was to oversee the global condemnation of actually existing socialism. By doing what? By working hand in glove with the intelligentsia. An enormous number of professors were publishing books that were circulated by, supported by, often the research was done by the IRD, this department in Great Britain, working hand in glove with the press, with BBC, with Reuters, with the entire, what Frank Wisner of the CIA called the mighty Wurlitzer, the entire jukebox, the global jukebox of information that was controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency, MI6, basically the bourgeois imperialist states that work for the capitalist ruling class. And so there's a lot of different elements going on here, but at least to sum that up, we need to keep in mind the funding structures and the material sources that are coming from the capitalist ruling class, as well as the disinformation agencies. This is what Ralph McGee said, that the essence of the Central Intelligence Agency, he worked for the CIA for 25 years, he said, is disinformation. That's what we fundamentally do in the Central Intelligence Agency, is we promote disinformation. And so that is one of the core elements of these operations, if it be CIA, MI6, or other agencies.
Thank you. And excellently stated. And sometimes it's quite out there in the open. Like I was looking through, after reading your article, through some of my older classical texts from the Frankfurt School. If you look at the acknowledgments, like at the bottom on most of them, it's Rockefeller Foundation. And it's like, how do people not make those connections? But that's tied into an example that I saw in an interchange on Facebook. I'm going to keep it anonymous, but Your article was recently shared on Facebook by an academic I am friends with, and soon after, a prominent Marcuse/Frankfurt School scholar, who I'm also connected with on the platform, replied to the article by saying that the Frankfurt School cannot be condemned for taking CIA money because they were looking for a third way that wasn't capitalism, nor what these people call Stalinism. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels like this Facebook response represents a bit more than the reply from one individual to another. The myth of the Black Legend, otherwise known as Stalin, seems to be the crutch these folks lay on for both their anti-communism and, connected to that, for their associations with imperialist interests and institutions. Therefore, although there are arguments one can make against this position without having to touch on the prevalent Stalin myths at all, how important is it to participate in a resuscitation of Stalin akin to how Domenico Losurdo, Grover Furr, and others have done?
Great and expensive question. The first thing that I would say is that the slander campaigns that were immediate as soon as I published this piece were to be expected, because the interests of academics within the capitalist core in particular, who have careers that have been based on being radical recuperators, appearing radical, but recuperating what they refer to, some of them, as Marxism or Marxian, approaches or other such things, to recuperate that within the capitalist imperialist fold. That means that they have a vested interest in not engaging with my scholarship, not taking seriously the claims that I make, not looking at the evidence in a scientific manner, right? Because in my case, it's not a subjective argument that I'm making. This isn't, me and my, axe to grind against these people. It's an attempt to contribute, like Domenico Losurdo and others have, to a collective project of elucidation, of clarifying the stakes of class struggle in theory. And so if these people are serious about being scholars and dealing with evidence, then instead of slandering me subjectively, they should deal with the objective evidence. And if they do that seriously, then they'd have to come up with a counter framework for explaining that evidence scientifically. And of course, it's much easier to try to kill the messenger than to deal with the message. And so I've unfortunately had to deal with a number of really heinous statements that have nothing to do with the material as it stands. So that's just an opening kind of proviso of sorts. The logic of the third way, right, is something that has been very prevalent throughout the Cold War. Is a bit of a strange term because it's the old war that's always been the war, and that is between capitalism and socialism. And the idea that you could have some type of alternative to the dominant socioeconomic system and an emergent socioeconomic system, and that this third way, since it hasn't manifested itself in full material form in any developed way, right? Because people will point to, oh, there was this little thing or that little thing, okay, but was there a nation state that for decades on end was invested in this project and built something around this project or not? What that means is a lot of the third way logic amounts to a kind of utopian socialism at best, right? If these people are actually socialists, then what they're advocating for is a form of socialism that would come about not through class struggle, not through the organization, like workers' organizations, not through parties, not through states, but somehow magically through the spontaneous actions of free democratic subjects. What we know from history, and Engels already diagnosed this in the 19th century, is that that is not just a pipe dream, it's structurally impossible. And when you think about it for 2 seconds, you'll understand why it's structurally impossible. The capitalist ruling class and their armies are not going to allow for that, right? They're just going to crush it. And look at history, that's what has happened. And so that third way logic is problematic for its utopian socialism, but it also is based upon the presumption, and this gets to the core of your question, that not only some things are to be criticized within actually existing socialism, and particularly Stalin and Stalinism within the Soviet Union, but absolutely everything, right? There's a logic of absolute evil, the crime of the century, the worst thing that could ever happen. There's no nuance. There's no sophistication. There's no multidimensional analysis. And notice, of course, the discrepancy here, because the rad-lib theorists, like the one you were alluding to on Facebook or on social media, these are the people who will endlessly say, you cannot say a single bad word about Adorno unless you've slept in his archive, read the private letters that he sent to a friend of mine, learned words in German that are no longer in existence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you can say in a single sentence that everything about the Soviet Union is totalitarian and we should condemn it, and it's just blood and death and horror, without citing a single reference, without ever engaging in any serious analysis of the material basis for those claims, because you don't need to, because what you're doing is you're genuflecting to the dominant ideology, the dominant orientation of anti-Stalinism and anti-communism. And so the people that you're writing for don't need you to reference anything because they're already in agreement with you, because what you're announcing is dogma. Dogma doesn't need a scientific basis, right? And so that's one of the things that I point out just with Horkheimer and Adorno. They said the most heinous and horrid things about everything in China, everything in the Soviet Union, about the Vietnamese people who are struggling for their liberation from the jackboot of Japanese, French, American imperialism. There's not a second where they say, oh yeah, maybe there's some poor peasant whose children are having the flesh stripped from their bodies by napalm, and that is not something that I should support, right? There's no nuance, absolutely no nuance. And so regarding Stalin, he has been made into this heinous bogeyman, this figure just to be vilified, and that is a bulwark against scientific analysis. It's an attempt to replace political analysis, concrete material political analysis, by a morally, I would say corrupt, but it purports to be moral, moral condemnation that is devoid of thought, right? And this is what the logic of the kind of absolute evil, the devil, has always done, right? They did the same thing with just about every figure that U.S. imperialism or European imperialism wants to go after. They just make them into these diabolical figures. And so when it comes to someone like Stalin, what we need to do is actually investigate, read his work, read the histories of the Soviet Union, not those written by Arthur Koestler, who was working with the CIA and MI6, not the very long list of Soviet scholarship that is directly funded, supported, and promoted by the capitalist ruling class and its intelligence services. Not those people. But instead, look at the people who dug into the archives, who have gone and spent time working through the materialist record, and who are nuanced in their approaches, and who are able to say things like Grover Furr, for instance, who you brought up. He pointed out in work with others, because this is a lot of Grover Furr's work is collaborative, that there appears to have been a conspiracy against Stalin in the lead up to and during World War II, in which Trotsky was going to work with a series of generals to overthrow the Soviet Union by working with the Nazis and the Japanese fascists. And Stalin caught word of this. And so there's a lot of talk of purges and whatnot, but there's little analysis of what was actually going on in that situation. If that is indeed the case, and what happened was that these generals were put on trial, they were found guilty, they admitted to their crimes, and they were purged from the army. This is an unbelievably dangerous thing to do in the Red Army right before the Nazis are basically going to, according to every global analyst, at least within the Western world, crush the Soviet Union. Incredible decision to make. Some historians claim that if he did not make that decision, he most likely would have lost World War II, meaning the Nazis would have crushed the Soviet Union, right? Do we know that for sure? It's a counterfactual. You can never know for sure. But these are very important elements to have be part of any conversation about actually existing socialism. So what we need is nuance, we need science, we need rigor, and we need to approach these issues in a non-dogmatic fashion. Unfortunately, there's a dearth of that type of approach within the capitalist core, but it also makes sense, right? Given what I said earlier, the people who are the dominant intellectuals are trained to think this way, they're trained to talk this way, and they become famous by doing this, right? That's part of their social function. So we shouldn't be surprised by it, but we should be able to identify it for what it is.
And there's a key paradox, just real quick because it's connected. There's a key paradox here because these are the same folks that point at Soviet theory, which they like to just describe always under this one vague term, Soviet Marxism, as if there wasn't a plethora of debates and different interpretations of Marxism or creative Marxism and all these different traditions. These are the people that point at that and say, oh, no, that's all mechanistic, it's dogmatic, it's only one thing. But they're the ones that are actually doing it. It's more of the same projection that the empire does today with respects to China and other countries. And at the end of the day, it's just bad scholarship. Like you read some of their critiques of the Soviet Union and Soviet theory, and maybe they're citing dialectical and historical materialism, but they're not engaging with actual Soviet academics. They're not engaging with many party theorists. They're not engaging with even just like the manuals. Like I've taken the time to look at the manuals because my dad studied in Cuba and he had to read the manuals. It was mandatory just even to graduate. And my dad's no theorist, but today my work revolves around Hegel and Marx, and I can talk to him because of the manuals. But I have everyone around me in academia telling me, you know, these manuals are so bad. It's like, well, why can't I talk to my dad? But if I talk to a student who I had him read Horkheimer or something within a year, I can't talk to him about theory, but he studied it 30, 40 years ago. So it's got to work somehow. But it's very lazy. And I've described it in my work as there's this Korean concept, hwaigwan. I might be mispronouncing it, but it's the activity of taking off your shoes before you go in the house. And that's kind of what like those anti-Stalin, anti-Soviet Union, anti-Marxism, Leninism, that's the role it plays for every new publication in the West, or at least most of them. Every new Marxist book, at the beginning, you always have to have that sort of activity, that ritualistic activity of condemning socialism, and then you can talk, right? Before you condemn Marxism, Leninism, your word doesn't count for anything. You have to do it, and then you can begin to talk.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, right? Because otherwise, what you have basically is if you don't genuflect to the dominant ideology, then your voice is structurally excluded from the conversation, right? And that's how liberal censorship functions in general, right? All ideas are welcome. Everybody can talk. We have, you know, an open system, but we all understand that there's a finite implicit limit and certain things are beyond the pale, right? And that's the I guess risk in some of the work that I've been doing is that it calls that out. And so when people get very angry and then have these just kind of incoherent rants against me, it's quite clear where that's coming from, right? We have to look at the latent content, just not the manifest content. And the latent content is when you touch the real, people freak the fuck out, right? Like they're like, oh yeah, this guy actually knows that I've been a charlatan all these years, and I've been pimping for imperialism. Why is he saying that? I thought we had an agreement. We didn't say that, you know? And particularly because I have the credentials of someone who did. I studied with all these people and like did it really seriously. It wasn't, I'm not the, you know, flippant, I don't have a flippant engagement and never have with any of these traditions. But more specifically to your point, because you raised a lot of things, Carlos, that are really important. One is that, you know, historical materialism is a science. There's a tendency, and it's fine if people use shorthand and it makes sense, you know, people be like Marxism, but you know, it was Marx and Engels, and it was actually the global working class movement. And they were articulating a science of history and political economy and social struggle, etc., within that collective world. And that didn't stop. And so when people say, oh, well, you don't understand Marxism, you have to reread Marx, or trying to like identify it just as a particular figure or a particular corpus or a particular body of work, it's a living collective tradition of social transformation. So historical materialism includes unbelievably important debates and disagreements. And some of those have been profoundly rich. Some of them have been resolved, I think, through practical struggle, where people were like, we should try this, we should try that. we tried that, it didn't work, right? So then you have to operate and undertake a process of self-critique, which is part of the science of historical materialism. There's no blueprint for this stuff. There's no absolute model. There's an ongoing collective articulation of a scientific project of social transformation. And so you are obviously 100% right that within the Soviet Union, there's not, Soviet Marxism. There's a plethora of positions and debates and disagreements and shifting alliances over time and backtracking on certain things. I mean, it's very complex and nuanced. And we should, if we're interested in doing scientific analysis, we should be as nuanced with the people that we're analyzing as these same analysts would be with Horkheimer, Adorno, or other figures. But it actually, of course, it plays a certain role because you see it all the time with historical materialism where the opening position is almost always making a straw person out of your adversary. Because the problem with science, right, for people who don't believe in it, is that it's really hard to refute. It's very hard to refute that there are contradictions in capitalism, that there's exploitation, that there's oppression, that there's imperialism. Like, as the great Michael Parenti was fond of saying, the problem that the reactionaries have is that reality is radical. Reality is exploitation and alienation and oppression. People feel these things. They live them on in a daily basis. And so if you're against understanding reality, and there's this science that's been developed collectively to figure out reality and to try to adjust it in such a way that it's more attuned with, human flourishing, for lack of a better word, but also the salvation of the biosphere and life itself, then the only way you can deal with it, and it's quite pathetic when you think of it, the only way that our adversaries can deal with it is by creating straw person arguments. And we've seen this again and again, right? If it be, you reduce Marxism to the Soviet Union, you reduce the Soviet Union to Soviet Marxism, and then you come up with some myth about that, and then you throw it all out. And there's lots of different ways in which this is done, but it's a process of oversimplification of your adversary in order to denigrate them and discredit them so you don't actually have to engage with their analyses and their practical accomplishments, right? Yeah, go ahead.
It's a whole nother monster to try to beat this whole body of scientific research than to just beat a moralizing argument. And that's part of how this tradition of Frankfurt School, which completely rejects science. Like if you look at the connection of the political to the theoretical, you see that in the theoretical, some of the central debates, the Engels debate, it's about rejecting dialectics of nature, just completely stepping away from the role that Marxism and dialectical materialism has in the sciences. Yeah. And one of the things that Adam Schaff, he's a Polish, he's critical of some of the things in the Soviet Union, but he was within the Marxist humanist tradition and somewhat compatible as well with Marxism, Leninism. He mentions that it's a whole other beast to beat this body of scientific work than to beat, just the moralizing arguments that were prevalent specifically with the Marxist humanist tradition.
No, absolutely. And they can't, right? So that's part of the problem. And it's not just, of course, Carlos, as I'm sure you know, because you were kind of alluding to it earlier, it's not just the theoretical arguments. It's the practical realities, right? Most people living in the United States today don't know that the UN has recognized that China has run the greatest poverty alleviation program in the history of humanity. How do you defeat, how do you denigrate that? I mean, we see how they do it. They make a straw person version out of China. They make it into authoritarian and domineering and controlling imperialist. Like how
neoliberal.
Exactly? And neoliberal,
they're neoliberal.
Yeah, they'll do anything that they can to try to take reality and transform it into a straw person version of reality. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you just hit pause for a second and you say, okay, well, let's not run with the straw person version. Let's actually unpack what's going on in actually existing socialism. Like, what was the situation in Cuba when they developed 5 different vaccines, even though they're under the most draconian stranglehold on the part of imperialist powers that have been for decades and decades trying to crush an example of actually existing socialism within the Western Hemisphere, right? All of this information is necessary for us to have a real and coherent debate about comparing and contrasting socialism and capitalism, and actually having serious debates. To come back to what Carlos was saying, I think it's really important for people to be able to sit down and say, I don't know, in the example of Cuba, there were some issues with gender and sexuality in the 60s, right, that have been really internally criticized within Cuba, and with the new family code and other things, there have been massive, massive changes due to internal critique. We need that internal critique. It's part of our lifeblood. It's what makes us stronger. It really makes us better. And for people involved in organizing, we know that, people make mistakes. Leadership makes mistakes. And we have to be able to work collectively to address those mistakes and change in order to improve that project. If we can do that, that gives us enormous power. If instead we're trapped in this world where we have to basically waste our time defending reality and say, no, exploitation exists because we're dealing with a bunch of, rad libs or academics whose own position within global class struggle disconnects their thoughtscape from the poor and working masses, that's not possible, right? So no to straw person, approaches to either actually existing socialism or the entire historical materialist approach. And yes, to bringing back in like nuance, self-critique, the complexity of these projects so that we can learn and collectively move forward as best that we can. And if I could just a final note on this is, one of the things that really bothers me about the straw person versions of Marxism is related actually to the article that we were talking about on the Frankfurt School, because it's part of a larger book project. And one of the elements in that book project is looking at the myth of white male Marxism, because this is so prevalent, right? One of the straw people, I guess, that is unbelievably prominent within the academy, but also within the larger cultural world, is that Marxists are bro white dudes who just like to talk a lot and who don't think about race and they don't think about women and blah, 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 blah. That reveals such a profound and deep ignorance of history and practical struggle that I wouldn't even know where to begin to address that. But one element to begin to address that is the internal critiques that you see in the history of the global communist movement, when the Third International broke with the social chauvinism of the Second International, and Lenin and the Bolsheviks took not only theoretical but practical positions on the colonial and the national question, on issues of racism, on issues of gender and sexuality, that radically broke with what you saw kind of you saw the limits of specific forms of social chauvinistic Marxism within the Second International, right? And so even the straw person that these people go after is actually an element within the Marxist tradition that has been internally criticized and has been surpassed in many ways in the practical struggles when you look at the Soviet Union's position on women in the colonial question, China's position, Vietnam, etc. And so I just thought that I would put that in there because it's one of the most frustrating things that I come across, particularly in the woke age of neoliberal identity politics, and the way in which identity politics is a class politics that is aimed at destroying class analysis, because it's a class politics from the PMC, from the professional managerial class.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that in a second, but I did want to say, you mentioned like Horkheimer and Adorno, Frankfurt School philosophers, their class character, both of them were from, bourgeois backgrounds. And Engels wrote the Utopian Socialist in 1880. Not one of them appears as a representative of the interests of that proletariat, which historical development had in the meantime produced. You described the Frankfurt School as sort of utopian socialist, but I wanted to bring it up to date, since you sort of mentioned how this is affecting today's discourse. And this might be a little controversial, but some on the right, and it's kind of a broad spectrum on the right, from relatively institutional and moderate to the far-flung right-wing fringe who denounce the rhinos, Republicans in name only. But there are some on the right who denounce political correctness, quote unquote, as cultural Marxism. So often this is the result of an erroneous conflation with Marxism with postmodernism, or admittedly, probably more rarely, a thinly veiled anti-Semitism. But is there a genuine Frankfurt School conspiracy? And if so, how connected is it with the fraught hegemony of political correctness or identity politics today? And you mentioned the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Are there any similar activities today that the CIA is involved in?
Big but important question. Just very quickly to clarify, I didn't want to suggest that the Frankfurt School kind of in general takes a position of being utopian socialists. I actually think that is them operating so-called at their best, in the sense that they're supporting socialism, even if it's just the idea of socialism, but nothing to do with the actual material practice.
I should say, part of my thinking with that too was Marx calls like some of the third way American socialists, like Henry George or Victoria Woodhull, he calls them panacea mongers. So they purport that their program will fix all the problems of the world, and I see some of that similar panacea mongering in some of the Frankfurt School philosophers too.
That's a great term, because that's precisely it, right? And the idealism is so clear in this. It's the panacea mongering, but what's the panacea? Is it a new practice of socialism? No, it's a new way of thinking. And it's a new way of thinking that you can only understand if you buy the consumer product, the book produced by this great thinker that will elucidate this for you in your own individual experience of consumption. And so it's obviously shot through with problems. But I'll speak, I guess, more pointedly to your question. There was a lot packed into it, so if I don't get all of it, come back at me. But what stuck with me was this relationship between political correctness and cultural Marxism. And the terminology of cultural Marxism is quite problematic, particularly given that the right wing within the United States picked up on it as a kind of target of sorts. And I think it's important to contextualize this, because a lot of what the far right has done historically within Europe and the United States, at least, is to try to redefine. They're constantly trying to shift the political horizon to the right. And so if you call Obama a communist and get away with it, and everybody thinks he's a communist, then you've successfully shifted everything to the right. Because if that guy's a communist and he's the extreme left wing, then we know what the extreme right wing is, right? Basically straight up fascism. And so there's a constant game of redefining the left. And the more you can redefine the hardest possible left as being further to the right, the more successful you are in your ideological campaign. And so cultural Marxism has partially played that role, where they latched onto, in particular, and there's this very funny film, there's the academic who had a lot of egg on his face for having been interviewed on it. Martin J, I believe, right? Anyway, it was an alt-right film that was made, and they did an interview with him, and he thought it was just about the history of the Frankfurt School. But they actually used him as a spokesperson for cultural Marxism and their slander of cultural Marxism. So he should have done a little bit more research regarding who he was being interviewed by. But given that particular film or TV expose and then other things around cultural Marxism, it's come a whipping post for the extreme right within the United States. But their understanding of cultural Marxism is more as a kind of ideological whipping post to shift things to the right, than in terms of the deeper history of what cultural Marxism is and the way in which historical materialists have understood this tradition. So I'll give a big shout out to Domenico Losordo, who everybody should be reading and rereading. In fact, Carlos gave a shout out earlier. He has an excellent book that I'm very pleased to say will be coming out in English. It's available in Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, called Western Marxism. And it's very different than Perry Anderson's Trotskyist account of Western Marxism, and in many ways a response to that. And what he does is he contextualizes this tradition of Western Marxism, which some people use interchangeably with cultural Marxism, because it's a form of Marxism that, I'm going to be very quick here because there's more nuance to it, but the big picture scenario is that within the capitalist core, there were Marxist academics who were increasingly distinct from those involved in actual political practice. So many of them didn't have ties to actual organizing, weren't in parties, etc. That Marxism became more and more speculative and invested in a kind of Hegelian turn and a concern with dialectics and speculative concerns and whatnot, less and less interested in political economy. came to identify much of actually existing socialism as not worthy of support, and then began investing in art and culture as the only thing that could potentially save us, because the utopian element of socialism would then be packaged within not just culture, but bourgeois culture, more specifically. If you know Adorno's work on aesthetics, right? It's this which is going to be able to somehow, more or less magically, through what I've called in some of my other work, the talisman complex. Like the product of artwork will have this charm to it that's going to somehow transform things, but the material linkages and the causalities are never explained. And so that, I think, is a much better understanding of what cultural Marxism is. And Todd Cronin's work, particularly in his book Red Aesthetics, there's a really interesting chapter that deals with some of this, and that is that within the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School, there is a kind of displacement that he maps out in the 40s from some, at least partial, concern with class politics, as nebulous as it might be, to an increasing concern with identity questions. And those questions, particularly around anti-Semitism, right, where Horkheimer and Adorno will focus on anti-Semitism without necessarily connecting the deep history of anti-Semitism to the deep history of global class struggle, right? Like people like Arno Mayer and lots of others have done, and I think have done very, very important work on, particularly around the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, which is a very important part of how anti-Semitism has historically functioned and needs to be part of those conversations. So Cronin's work, I think, does a good job of connecting this kind of identitarian shift, if you will, that you see nascent in the Frankfurt School, and it then really comes to the fore in the neoliberal phase of capitalist accumulation, where it's claimed that, class analysis is retrograde, it's old school, it's reductivist, and all of these things have already been internally criticized within the Marxist tradition, like the critique of economism. Like, where do you start? At the very beginning. It's everywhere in that tradition. And so that identitarian logic also, I think, is part of how the global theory industry operates today, where when you look at what is hot, and Adolf Reed's work on this is excellent, it's the diversity industry, right? What we want is black faces in high places, but we got to make sure that those black faces are doing the work of those high places, right? That's what's important. And so the structural relations are the same, and all that you do is you change the appearance of the people running them. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this might have changed within the last year, but the director of the Ford Foundation is now a black man, right? You look at the history of the Ford Foundation, it's like white guys forever, and then there's a black man. Does this mean that the Ford Foundation is now somehow on board with racial liberation? No, it means that they're doing the same thing they always do, and that is they traffic in the symbolism of change in order to keep the substance of social transformation at bay. Right? They do it time and again. I think some people should get a lot better at identifying it for what it is, because it's really simplistic propaganda. You kind of want to say to these people, like, come on, quit messing with us here. This is a little too simple. We know that you're not for the poor and working masses who've been racialized by the system of colonial capitalism. I don't know if Mitch, did that address, because there were a few other things that you tacked on at the end. So
yeah, the other thing was, so we talked about the Congress of Cultural Freedom and their interfacing with the Frankfurt School, and you mentioned that they did kind of rebrand a couple times. And you also mentioned that the Ford Foundation, is still in existence, still gives grants and things and everything. But maybe it's speculation or something. But is there anything that you think is similar to the Congress of Cultural Freedom today?
Yeah, well, what happened with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, they were repackaged as another organization. Instead of having funding from both Ford and CIA, they just redistributed and just had the funding from Ford. And they kind of limped along for a little while, and then realized that the rebranding campaign wasn't working out. And so then they changed. There's not a kind of centralized organization that I'm aware of, at least, like the Congress for Cultural Freedom or the Information Research Department that I was talking about earlier in Great Britain. But there's a plethora, like an endless number of think tanks to begin with, that have an unbelievable influence on, if it be public policy or the kind of thoughtscape of the general population, as well as the academic world. There continue to be, of course, an inordinate number of, in fact, the CIA itself admitted in 1975 that they were working with thousands of US academics at hundreds of US academic institutions. The person who actually was in charge of writing this report was CIA. And so this is what most people within the lingo would refer to as a limited hangout, meaning you give some information in order to run cover for larger operations. Nothing has been done in order to change that relationship. In fact, on the contrary, in the research that I've done, I've found a whole series of connections that are ongoing between not just the CIA, but also the FBI and other intelligence agencies and the university system. I know students who are approached to be recruited by the CIA. Actually, Carlos, since you brought up Cuba earlier, I'll give a shout out to, I believe his name is Raúl Antonio Capote, who wrote El Enemigo, which is an excellent book. He's a university professor in Cuba who worked for the CIA, but unbeknownst to the CIA, he was also working for Cuban intelligence. And so it's this incredible story that just came out in the early 21st century when he wrote the book about the ongoing operations, global operations based on university campuses, mobilizing the intelligentsia, the cultural producers, because he's a literary writer himself as well, literary circles, in order to try to leverage the youth in particular in Cuba in the direction of support for the counter-revolution. And so, that's one example. There's another really interesting book that has some limits. The name is escaping me right now. I could follow up and share it with you later. That does look at the number of FBI connections to the contemporary U.S. Academy. It's pretty extraordinary. The series of connections as well, not just at the professoriate level, but at the administrative level, right? And so that combined with the fact that a lot of what we're dealing with in the contemporary world is institutional inertia. So the Russian Institute at Columbia and at Harvard, two of the most important centers for Sovietology, for the history of the Soviet Union, they're CIA. This is very well documented. They were set up in basically internal meetings between CIA, the universities in question, including, of course, presidents and deans and whatnot, and I believe it was Carnegie money in particular, but foundation money, capitalist money. And Marcuse, of course, who worked for the OSS, which was the predecessor organization to the Central Intelligence Agency, then went to work at Columbia, and I believe he was at Harvard for a year as well, at the Russian Institute, where he wrote his book, Soviet Marxism. And if you look at the acknowledgments, who does he thank? He thanks a whole series of people who are OSS. These are operatives for the U.S. government, like he himself was. And so the fact that these institutions were set up under that framework, and governance has changed over time, the personnel has changed, the structural mechanisms are still there. So there's the institutional inertia to these projects. If you look at the work of like Anne Applebaum, for instance, who's writes for The Atlantic and is one of the most virulent anti-communists and most visible journalists doing anti-communist propaganda, like her connections to, I'd have to look at my notes to remember the exact connections, but I believe she's also worked with the USAID and other agencies that are basically, and USIS connected to government propaganda. And so the final thing that I'll say on this is one of the reasons that a lot of my research has focused on the time period of like the 1940s to about the 1980s is because through Freedom of Information Act requests and through my archival research, I can get access to a lot of information from that time period, whereas over the last 30 or 40 years, a lot of it's still under lock and key. And so I'm certain that it's going on. There are plenty of signs that it's going on, but in order to, again, scientifically verify and be able to say definitively that, the CIA has admitted it themselves that we don't have enough of the information, as much information as we will, I think, in 50 years.
I just connected. You mentioned the Soviet Marxism text, and that's after reading your article. I mentioned I looked through all these books and the acknowledgement, which we never really read. We should, now I know, now we know, but it does mention all of that. But one of the interesting things that I wanted to mention, because you also referenced Los Zurdos, Western Marxism, which I didn't know was being translated to English. I had to read it in Spanish. But one of the central things that he talks about is the role of the colonial question and the part that it takes in the split between Eastern and Western Marxism. And what's interesting about that book, Soviet Marxism and Marcuse in general, and the less pessimistic writings of his, is that there seems to be a weird, what now we see in trends as Maoism, Maoist third worldism, which completely misinterprets Lenin's theory of the labor aristocracy and says that everyone in the Imperial North, every worker in the Imperial North is part of the labor aristocracy. And therefore, the only potential for revolution can come from outside. And this is central to, most of his work, that the working class has been absorbed. It is revolutionary, futile. So how do you read that in light of the deficiency that this Western Marxist tradition has with the colonial question? And how do you fight it? Because it has like most of their work, the view of being radical, of centering the third world. And I think Badiou is another person that does something similar with the labor aristocracy. How do you combat that?
Great question. I think you're right that, just to pick up on the first thing you said, one of the most significant contributions on the part of Losurdo, but Losurdo is part of a collective tradition, of course, and he's picking up on a tradition that goes directly back to Lenin's work on the colonial question and Stalin's work on the colonial question, both theoretically and practically, of course. And that what was one of the central contributions, of course, and Walter Rodney's work and B.J. Pasha, there's a lot of people who've written quite poignantly on these topics, was to recognize that the colonial question had to be at the core of revolutionary organizing, because capitalism is a colonial project through and through. And therefore, again, regarding what I said earlier about the kind of myth of white male Marxism, it's like, what are you talking about? The very essence of the entire tradition is to take not only seriously the colonial question, but to center the colonial question. And doing that in a context of the Third International, when the core of the Second International had taken positions that on the colonial issue were problematic, to say the least, meaning benefiting from the wages of colonialism and basically being content with a kind of evolutionary program in which they thought the ruling class could be voted out of power, or at least potentially kind of kept at bay. And so there is a problem within that form of the Marxist tradition, the Second International Marxism, of a social chauvinist, pro-colonial, and ultimately pro-imperialist, and trafficking and fascism as well. That whole tradition is highly problematic. And so the Third International, as it emerges, is in part, at least, a radical critique of that. But a critique, I think, that is not just a theoretical critique, it's a critique that resituates those phenomena in relationship to the economic base. And so I think from our vantage point 100 years later, you can look back on it and think, well, and Lenin was already saying this, of course, there are structural reasons why the leaders of the European working class movement could easily kind of fall asleep at the colonial wheel, so to speak, because they would not be as conscious materially of the ravages of colonialism and of the importance of centering the colonial question. And so I do think there's an ongoing problem with social chauvinism within the capitalist core, and there are reasons for that. And I think that a lot of the work that we're talking about, the kind of radical recuperators or the pseudo-Marxists, a lot of them are social chauvinists through and through. In fact, that's one of the kind of programmatic elements of their orientation, is that they don't investigate the Soviet Union or China, because why would you study barbarians? These are savages, they're not civilized. They don't listen to Schoenberg. Who are these people? And so the social chauvinism is really a programmatic element to their orientation. Now, Maoism is a pretty complex phenomenon, right? Because there's so many different versions of it and splits and whatnot. And I don't want to overgeneralize or things like that. But I do think that there are elements within a cultural form of Maoism that you find in Badiou and you find in other thinkers and some activists within the capitalist core that consist in saying that, well, Maoism is great because of the Cultural Revolution, and in particular, the more kind of anarchist elements that people either read into or find in the Cultural Revolution, that is, bombard the headquarters kind of logic, that we have to go after leadership, etc. So they interpret the Cultural Revolution as a revolution within the revolution, meaning a revolution against the state and against the party. And so there's a very anarchist element that drives a lot of that type of Maoist orientation that you find in Badiou that amounts to a kind of anti-party, anti-state orientation, which I would refer to as anarcho-anti-communism. Because if you don't want to work with parties and organizations, you don't want to set up states to leverage power away from the capitalist ruling class, then you're satisfying yourself with a kind of anarchist orientation where you want, freedom and equality, which is great. Like, all anarchists on board in that regard, like what they advocate for in many instances is, spot on. But the way of getting there is where there are problems, right? We're not going to get there just by getting together and freely associating. We're going to get there because there's a struggle ahead, and we got to get organized if we want to actually win that struggle. So part of that organizing, maybe finally to connect to what you're saying about the kind of third world Maoism, is that the working class is global. And the stakes of the struggle that we are faced with are so massive that we're not only dealing with a situation of increased global inequality, but even according to the UN now, human extinction is on the horizon, right? It is very possible. And in fact, that's where the capitalist system is headed. The collapse of food chains and the most horrific rending of the natural fabric, of the dialectics of nature, if you will. And so the stakes of class struggle, I think, in our moment could not be higher. Combined with the fact that you have a decaying capitalist system, which I think is crystal clear, particularly in the case of the US empire, and an emergent socialist force, particularly in the case of China with the Belt and Road Initiative and developmental projects that are very different than what you find in the IMF and World Bank. And so you have an increasing turn to authoritarian fascism on the right, and a very robust kind of web of socialist state building projects on the other hand. And so there's an increasing, as you see with the pivot to China, beginning with Obama and following, there's the Cold War never ended, right? It just took on different forms. And so if we're interested in an egalitarian politics of liberation, we need to find very concrete tactics for bringing the global working class together and educating the global working class in the struggle and in what needs to be done to get where we need to go. Assuming that all people within the capitalist core would suffer from such a deep form of social chauvinism that they could never either be allies in the struggle or build a robust movement is not only a bad assumption theoretically, it's practically incorrect, right? Like, since we've been talking a little bit tangentially about Cuban politics, you look at how important the Cuban government has said very explicitly how important the anti-imperialist movement within the United States is. Giving shout outs. These are the parties. These are the organizations. These are the people who are doing something to end the blockade and to, allow some semblance of freedom within Cuba in relationship to the international stranglehold. And so that's what we need. We need an internationalist politics of class solidarity in which we're educating one another too. We're calling out our social chauvinism if we suffer from it. We're seeing it where it manifests itself, but we also don't suffer from a reverse cultural identitarianism where we say, well, the only true revolutionary subjects are those who are born in the global South. What does that mean, right? Like, how many reactionaries were born in the global South? That's not analysis. That's a simplistic flattening of global class struggle.
And it lets you just sit back and not do anything, because the working class here is a priori, futile. Why organize them at all? Just wait for the third world to do everything. And if you go to the third world as a communist and you ask them, hey, what should we do? They tell you, go the fuck back home and have a revolution there. That's our main enemy. That's the main obstacle in front of our struggles, right? So it's we haven't heard from you in a while. I don't know if you have a question, Royland, in there.
Can I just follow up a really quick point is that there's a third world fetishism that I think really needs to be called out and broken with. And on top of that, I'll give a shout out to a lot of my comrades and fellow organizers for the People's Summit. If you followed what was going on in LA, right? This is people power. This is bringing people together and bringing, it's transnational organizing within the imperialist core, saying this is what America looks like, right? It's not your America, it's not your imperialist America, and we across the Americas are organizing on this basis. And we need that and a lot more of that, right? Not just within the Americas, of course, but internationally.
And Miguel Diaz-Canel's address to the Sum of the Americas, he said, the America of immigrants and of, people who were historically enslaved and of the working class is always our sister and will never be our enemy. That America that resists the empire. So yeah, I think a lot of what you were talking about as far as this third world fetishism comes from the book Settlers by Jay Sakai, which is a very mysterious figure and not much is known about him. So I think people can let their imaginations run wild about that. But ultimately, the arguments stand on their own merits, and the argument is for first world socialists, revolutionaries to do nothing and wait for the third world. So
to me, it seems as if there's always some excuse, no matter what the academic says or what the think tank or whoever it is says, for us to sit on our hands and do nothing. Whether it's that our working class are all backwards and evil or bought off or whatever it's been, always there's some
the interest to vote.
Right. Well, always it's some way of protecting the system. I got distracted with a phone call from my son who's in Australia, but you brought up Jay Sakai, and we do have some good stuff on our website by some of our authors about that. I had a question that sort of relates to the social chauvinism and the Second International. I think one of the really elucidating arguments that was had within that, and when the Bolsheviks broke with that, was the debate between self-determination and cultural self-determination. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that and how we could sort of apply that to the global theory industry and what they say today versus what people like us would say.
Yeah, let me just say, first off, regarding your first comments, I couldn't agree more that a lot of the dominant ideology tries to convince us in various and sundry ways that the only thing we can do is nothing. And either they say, as Adorno himself said, the only solution is despair, right? And they think that this is good, or they find other ways, like you can't change the system, the working class is all corrupt, they are all fascists, they are all this, that, or the other thing. All kind of straw person versions of what the working class is anyway, because as Carlos was saying earlier, right, the working class is also, it's not just the Soviet Union and Soviet Marxism that's quite complex. Working class is a complex formation. There's lots of different orientations and lots of different room as well for political education, for political organizing and things like this. And I think one of the most important things that we should all be constantly reminding ourselves of is the central importance not only of doing something, but of connecting to organizations and building power collectively. Get in an org, get connected to people, do things that matter, and educate yourself in the process. And that is one of the single most important things that I think anyone should do, and we should be constantly shouting from the hilltops. Sign up, show up, strap it on, get involved, and be part of something, because it's crucially important. And if you find out that there are problems with the org, or that being part of an organization doesn't mean, there's all these myths about parties as well, like, oh, they're just going to tell you what to do and all the leadership's corrupt and blah blah blah. No, an organization is composed of its members, and so you're part of that collective. And if you get involved in something, you're like, they don't really have the right line. Maybe you don't have the right line. Like, maybe you should learn a little something first and be involved and like work through things practically, and then adjust that accordingly, because there's a dialectical relationship between your subjectivity and all of the other people who are in an organization, right? This is a complex organic phenomenon. It's not just leadership or me as subject. I'm gonna like invent what the org should do. So that I just thought, Noah, was a really important point to hammer home. Regarding the position that the Bolsheviks took on the national question, and Lenin in particular is crystal clear on this, right? It's an absolute right to the self-determination of peoples. This is undebatable, right? They have the right to self-determine. And as unfortunately many people don't know, when the Soviet Union was founded, there were then referenda for the various country members of the Soviet Union. Do you want to be a member or not? Because you have the right to self-determine. So this wasn't theory. This was a theory that was a practice. And it was implemented. And what happened with that? Well, it worked remarkably well. All of these Soviet states said, yeah, we want to be part of this socialist world-making project. And in fact, if you look at the stats for a lot of the referenda after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I mean, there's so many people, in many cases, the majority of citizens who say, yeah, we wish we had the Soviet Union back, because this capitalist destruction of our world is palpable. Life expectancy goes down, sex working goes up. Like, there's a whole series of problems with the dismantling of the Soviet Union that we could talk about. And so that absolute right to the self-determination of nations, I think in Lenin's case and for the Bolsheviks, it's not culturalism. And this, I think, is really difficult for a lot of contemporary readers to understand, because they think, well, self-determination of nations, that means me and my culture or ethnic group, however I define that, or it's defined by the dominant culture, have this set of rights. And what it amounts to, culturalism and identitarian politics, is a non-dialectical understanding of identity, of nations, of cultures, etc. So Lenin never said, oh, well, there are these fixed static blocks that are cultures or races or nations. And even his vocabulary for talking about this, and the Bolshevik vocabulary, is quite interesting because it's a national question. And race is part of that, but he's not talking about race like these categories, like, oh, you're black and you have these rights, and you're white and you have these rights. The national question is about the right on the part of a historically formed community to self-define dialectically. And that's an ongoing process. It's not the culturalist approach that tends to be substantialist and rigidifying and say, this is our culture, this is how we are, we're Latinos, we all think this way or we all feel this way, which is the most absurd thing imaginable, right? It's an imaginary category to begin with, a Latino, or any other, national or cultural category like that. And so another aspect to Lenin's orientation on this front is that instead of beginning with bourgeois ideological categories, which is what nation states are, that's what a nationality is. Nationalities emerged with the nation state formation under capitalism through the course of the long 19th century. Or with the racial categories that go hand in hand with colonial capitalism and the targeting of certain populations for super exploitation, right? And those change over time, and they have changed over time. And so you shouldn't just begin with national categories or racial categories as fixed substances and then engage in identity politics and say things like, well, I'm this category and therefore I have this set of rights or whatever else it might be. Instead, you need a dialectical apprehension that recognizes that each subject has been formed by a cultural collective, and that just as that subject has a certain amount of freedom, that cultural collective should have the right to self-determine, meaning self-define itself, not be a pre-given substance that was defined by the ideologies of capitalism, but self-articulate itself, which is an ongoing process, right? And so I'm kind of speaking perhaps a little bit more abstractly than usual because a little bit philosophical, but the basic point is that there's a difference between a dialectical approach to identity and a culturalist or identitarian approach to identity. And the dialectical approach recognizes that identity is collectively forged through ongoing processes of self-articulation, if you will. Noah, does that help?
That's 100% the sort of thing I was looking for. Thank you so much.
I think that's especially, relevant to the United States because the working class of the United States is one of the most nationally and racially diverse working classes in the world. And Lenin understood that socialism will only succeed in the United States if the majority of the working class are on the side of the socialists. So it's really important for us to unite with that diverse working class and unite with people that are different than us.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, that's, you go back through the Marxist and Leninist tradition, you see again and again and again, all of the, not just figures, but all of the, you know, people with just boots on the ground doing work in the Communist Party in the 1930s. What were they doing? They were desegregating, amongst other things, you know, hammer and hoe style. They were working across the borders between city organizing and in the agricultural sector. And so if the myth of white male Marxism is just so clear in instances like this, because it's, you know, most people's version of civil rights within the United States is this very simplistic idea that somehow in the 1960s and 1970s, you know, through the kind of liberal narrative, these became part of the mainstream. But in fact, no, there was anti-racist organizing going on from a materialist, workers-based point of view and point of struggle from, you know, the beginning. And that you really saw this very clearly, and particularly in the interwar period with the Communist Party USA at that point in time.
Well said. I have one longer question. I'm usually somewhat annoyed when people do interviews and they just have these really long questions, but I did it twice. But
I'll take notes.
A while back, our counseling editor, Thomas Riggins, told me a story about his meeting with Norman Thomas, then head of the Socialist Party USA in the 60s. Riggins asked Thomas, which is weird because Thomas is Thomas Riggins, but Riggins asked Thomas, we're going by last names, why he supported certain positions and movements which aligned him with the State Department and their anti-communist campaigns. Thomas's reply was that, quote, if the CIA is dumb enough to fund our projects, let them do it. This reply was not satisfactory for Riggins, and with time, he saw the limitations of SPA and the limitations of this left anti-communism and ultimately turned towards Marxism-Leninism. For Riggins, his SPA time represented a necessary moment, in the Hegelian sense, for his arrival at Marxism-Leninism. Similarly, for many communists in my generation, the Bernie Sanders 2016 and 2020 campaigns were our entry points into socialist politics, and with time, having observed the right opportunist character and the limitations of this left anti-communist social democratic approach, we arrived at Marxism-Leninism. I would like to ask you two questions here. Okay. First, what relationship do you think the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory has to other forms of left anti-communism? And second, how should these intermediary moments of left anti-communism, which for many serve as an essential step towards Marxism-Leninism, which, for instance, I think you're one of the folks along with me and Riggins, how should this be understood? Are they from the start a deviation away from Marxism-Leninism for those who begin to develop dissenting attitudes to the existing order? Are they a necessary moment that must be overcome in the transition towards Marxism-Leninism, or are they both?
And the they, in that case, is the kind of social democratic politics of...
Yeah, the left anti-communist position, yeah.
And by left anti-communism, you kind of mean the either DSA or kind of...
There's different forms, right? That's part of what I'm asking in the first one, like, because I see the Frankfurt School and the critical theory industry as participation in some form of left anti-communism. And I'd like to know what sort of relationship does that have to the more direct inheritors of the tradition of the Second International.
Gotcha. Yeah. Let me just say, first and foremost, the statement that you shared about if the CIA funds us, so be it, is a kind of an interesting statement, right? Because there, I think sometimes people in looking at what I consider part of what I'm doing is a political economy of ideas. I'm not just interested in ideas, I'm interested in the acknowledgements pages, right? Who's funding these ideas? Oh, is it the Rand Corporation? Oh, that's why Fukuyama's book became so famous, because the Rand Corporation was behind it, amongst other things. And so the simple fact that the CIA or Ford Foundation, et cetera, would fund certain people doesn't, you can't flatten that analysis, meaning that you have to look at the economic base and its relationship to the subjects that they happen to be supporting. And I know that there are people who have gotten Ford Foundation grants and other such things, and subjectively, their orientation is not that of the Ford Foundation. So if you can get money and use it for projects that are, in the direction that are progressive in the sense that I would understand it, then great. But I also know that the people who are giving this money are quite smart about the people they're giving the money to. And so in almost all cases, the people who are getting the real funding stream are the ones who are delivering the goods. So you might be able to get one grant or a small grant or something like that, but if you want the big package, you got to give them everything. And so I think that's also important to recognize, because there's a relationship between the objective forces of political economy and the subjective orientation of those who are doing particular work. And so there's been these, I just highlight this because there's been some trite critiques of the thing I wrote on the Frankfurt School saying, oh yeah, but Engels' father was a factory owner and Marx was going to the library and Engels was supporting, it's kind of really cheap lifestyle anarchist orientation that really doesn't understand anything about anything, because everybody has to live and everybody has to find funding. And if you're going to do intellectual work, you need some material support for that. And in a capitalist world, wherever you find that support is probably going to be somewhat compromised, because that's the nature of the world that you're living in. And what really matters is, what do you do with your subjective agency, right? And Marx's subjective agency wasn't, just supporting Engels' father's orientation in his factory. It was the opposite. So we have to keep subjective agency in the forefront. So sorry, that was a bit of an aside. But on left anti-communism, I think that the Frankfurt School has played a really fundamental role in the constitution of left anti-communism within the academy. We should not overemphasize their influence, because a lot of people, you talk to working class people or organizers, they're like, what are you talking about? Frankfurt School? I don't know who these people are. So it's quite niche, and it's, at one level, that's probably a good thing, because it hasn't had as pernicious an effect more broadly. But they're part of a more general orientation of left anti-communism that I think has had more wide effects within the broad organizing within. I'll just speak from the places that I know best, which are France and the United States. And within that world, there has definitely been a very consolidated ideology on the left that, if you're a Marxist or if you are a radical or whatever term you want to use, you can be that, and you can be involved in big organizations, and there's a lot of them, but you have to be against actually existing socialism. That is the dividing line. And so Trotskyism is, of course, the most widespread form of Marxism within the intelligentsia. And we've seen, there are so many examples of this, I wouldn't even know where to start. And some Trotskyists do excellent critical analyses and have made significant contributions when it's a matter of unpacking the nefarious mechanisms operative within capitalism, when it's a matter of analyzing actually existing socialism, or outlining the series of interlocking tactics that we need to use to get from where we are to the strategy of where we want to be. There are very profound, not only problems, but deep issues that have and continue to lead to class struggle between, Ho Chi Minh said, well, we can work with some opportunists, but as far as the Trotskyists go, these people are turncoats and will just stab you in the back. We can't work with any of them. So there's been some serious, difficulties historically. And so I see left anti-communism beyond the academy as being much more within the organizing world of like Trotskyism and anarchism and other versions, some forms of Maoism, some forms of, just utopian socialism in general, I think have a much more expansive reach than, just the Frankfurt School. So it's part of a larger problem. And it also makes sense when you see it from a structural level, right? That within the capitalist core, there would be such, there's support. You can carve out space for yourself, writing for the New Left Review and being a very prominent intellectual and being kind of wined and dined on all the junkets and being invited on Democracy Now! And you have access to all of that. If you go beyond the pale, though, all of that's cut off, right? And you're immediately sequestered from that. And the second question is a really interesting one, Carlos, and I don't think I have a great response to it, in part because I think that the way in which kind of social democratic orientations or left anti-communist orientations operate is that I think there are structural forces that drive their emergence, and that it's not surprising that they're so prominent within the world that I have come up in. Was it a stepping stone for me in my own political education? Yeah, it was. Was it a hindrance and a bulwark? Yeah, it was. So I think that existentially, you know, how would we refer to that? A gateway drug, an impediment? I don't know. So I don't see it as like one of the ways that I think is helpful for historical materialists to think about what we're doing at an organizational level is we're working through tactics based in our particular conjuncture of where we're organizing that are hopefully interlocked to other tactics so we can build power over time and get to our strategy. And good organizers are good at identifying the best tactics for each moment and interlocking them with the move to the next level. Not just plateauing and like doing the same thing again and again and again, but identifying what works, what doesn't, moving on to the next level, hopefully. And I don't see the kind of left anti-communism as necessarily playing that role. And definitely not being something that would be a kind of required stepping stone. I think that in our case, I don't know much about your background and other such things, but for me, one of the reasons that I was exposed to these ideas is that within the academy and within, you know, if it be my involvement in the Occupy movement or in organizing in France prior to that, this is what's on offer. There's like a lot of left anti-communism. And so if you go to anarchist bookstores or Trotskyist conversations and things like this, it's all over the place. What is really interesting, though, and I'm glad that you kind of pointed out, because we don't only want to have a conversation that's quite operates at the macro objective level. We also want to connect this to our existential subjective experiences. And I do think one of the things that is the most invigorating and exciting to me right now in our historical moment is the number of young people who are really recognizing what this world is all about and doing it at a pace that definitely in relationship to my generation, like I went to undergraduate in the early 90s. It was like the dark ages of communist consciousness. It was horrible. Derrida was kind of all that was on offer. The younger generation, I think that a combination of factors, you know, global warming, imperialism, Sanders lining up on the DNC, like a lot of different things have led that generation to recognize that, okay, what's on offer isn't what is going to actually solve these problems. And so there's a radicalization among the youth that is really inspiring, really invigorating, and an incredible growth in the socialist movement within the United States. And that growth, I think, is largely driven by the recognition that the political solutions that are being offered don't measure up to the enormity of the stakes and the problems that we're faced with. And therefore, we need more radical solutions. And hopefully, as well, increased political education, because there's a lot of great orgs out there doing good work, a lot of great podcasts and platforms for people to educate themselves. And the word's getting out that if you want to solve these problems, people have been involved in a collective process of solving them for centuries, and they've given us incredible resources. So you don't have to just get plugged into what happens to be in your immediate environment. You can get plugged into the history of global class struggle and the people who've been doing this and have so much to teach us about how this is to be done. And that's an exciting thing. And it's been exciting for me personally, too, because I have to say, I was, you know, I didn't come up I'm not a red diaper baby, you know, I did not come up in a context where there were structural forces that were driving me in the direction that my political consciousness went in. On the contrary. So I don't know if, Carlos, does that help a little bit with the second question?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it was a question that could have an answer. That's part why I asked it, because there is that that contradictory nature, right? When there's nothing, when there's no like institutional alternative that can lead people with dissenting views to a Marxist-Leninist position, or a position of Marxism that's in favor of actually existing socialism. The only role that you can use to get there is this sort of left anti-communism, see its limitations, and then get there. I think that might be changing now. I think that because of the social media and the internet, there's a lot of ways to access Marxist-Leninist creators and projects, and there's a lot of good institutions being built that are preventing people, at least I've seen some younger folks, from having this intermediary step. But I feel like for many generations of Americans in the past that have got into Marxism-Leninism, they needed some form of a mistake in order to get to the right position.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And you can see the structural reasons for that too. Like if you've had that experience, and I've had that, and I know a lot of other people have had that as well. These aren't arbitrary, subjective, circumstances. There's structural factors. One thing I'll just say really quickly is institution building is so important, because just as we were saying earlier, the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the IRD, this is institution building. And there are enormous institutions, right? CNN and Disney, and these are institutions. They're constantly pumping out nonstop propaganda. And so if we want to really counter that and give people access to, because the point isn't to like indoctrinate people, the point is to give them knowledge so that they can figure out how the world actually works, and they can contribute to the liberation of others and the liberation of themselves. And so to create those gateways to that knowledge and those skills that are part of this tradition, institutions are so important. And these institutions can be educational projects like the critical theory workshop that I'm involved in, but they can be podcasts, they can be news platforms, it takes lots of different forms. Cultural production, artists, musicians, we need to hear from you. I see the guitar in the background there, or a bass maybe. Like, we need these messages getting out there, because that is what will help bring people into the struggle and help us build the collective power necessary in order to get where we need to go.
Yeah, one of the people you talked about, or that you quoted in your piece, was Bertolt Brecht, who, speaking of funding, Bertolt Brecht called the Frankfurt School prostitutes in their quest for foundation support during their American exile, selling their skills and opinions as commodities in order to support the dominant ideology of repressive U.S. society. But Brecht was a playwright and a poet, most famous for the satirical musical Three Penny Opera. But you mentioned that Brecht was sort of a thorn in the Frankfurt School's side, and his influence on Walter Benjamin. Would you? I know we're kind of running long here, but would you mind talking about that briefly, and maybe tying that into your theory about revolutionary art?
Yeah.
Could I add a little side bit onto this question? One of the things that you wrote that really, really interested me was connecting the Frankfurt School to Walter Benjamin's suicide.
Yeah.
Could you explain sort of how that happened a little bit for the audience?
Yeah. And I'll be brief here, because I do have to probably run in like 10-15. So as I outline in the article, Benjamin, of course, was was Jewish and was an out Marxist, and he had sought exile in France and saw the writing on the wall and was going to try to get out because Vichy France, in fact, Annie Lacquaris has done excellent work on this. It worked hand in glove with, basically they chose to surrender to Hitler and bring fascism to France. And so Benjamin wanted to get out, and he was trying. He received a monthly stipend from the Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School, at that point in time, and was collaborating with them on various projects. But there was an ongoing kind of tension, particularly between Adorno on the one hand, who was overseeing Benjamin's writing projects, and then Benjamin on the other. And one of the sticking points was what Adorno and Horkheimer referred to in some of their correspondence as the savage influence of Brecht on Benjamin. What they meant by that is Brecht, and both Brecht and Benjamin, they're complex figures, and there's other things that one could say about political decisions they did or didn't make. So it's not like saying everything they did is perfect and everything Adorno and Horkheimer did was awful. So just as a quick proviso. But Benjamin had been close with Brecht, and they both had, to a greater or lesser extent, a dedication to socialism that was not the kind of utopian socialist at best and clearly left anti-communist position that Adorno and Horkheimer held. And so Benjamin started to fear for his life because his stipend, as Horkheimer told him shortly before he ended up committing suicide, was going to be cut off. And what many scholars had assumed for various reasons is that there wasn't enough funding to support Benjamin's trip to the United States. And they did do a few other things. They were trying to get him a visa. They were corresponding with him. But financially, and this isn't my analysis, it's Ulrich Frei's analysis, which is a very detailed analysis of archival records. And what he demonstrates, I think, very convincingly, and Helmut Harry Lewin was one of the scholars and one of my interlocutors who pointed this out to me. He went through the financial documents and found out that actually Horkheimer had access to tens of thousands, and then later, like a month later, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there was plenty of money. They were flush with cash. But Horkheimer was not even willing to spend a few $100s to pay for the steamship that Benjamin could have taken to the United States. And so Ulrich Fries basically accuses Adorno and Horkheimer as being at least partially responsible for his untimely suicide. He crossed the border into Spain, got caught, and was going to be sent back the next morning to France, where he was almost certainly going to fall into the hands of the Nazis and or Nazi collaborators. And instead of doing that, he decided to kill himself. And so that story, very tragic, was then subjected to a kind of cover-up campaign on the part of Adorno and Horkheimer. And Ulrich Fries again goes into some detail about this, where Adorno and Horkheimer said, oh, how could he have committed suicide? We had given them the keys to the city. He was to become a permanent member of the Institute. We offered to do this, that, and the other thing for him. It must have just been for subjective reasons that he killed himself. So this raises very, very serious questions, not just about the politics of Adorno and Horkheimer, but about their ethical orientation, right? Because many times people who are radlibs or liberals will claim that moralism is on their side and these authoritarians are just interested in changing the political world and they don't care about human beings. No, there's an ethics, a very profound ethics that Ho Chi Minh referred to as the kind of ethics of communism, where you care for your people, you take care of them. If someone is downtrodden, if someone is going to, risk being killed or die, then, you're going to spend that money not on a PR firm to promote your work, which is one of the things that Horkheimer did. You're going to do that to save somebody. And so it raises fundamental ethical questions. And so I'd encourage people, the article that Ulrich Fries wrote that came out just a year or two ago is written in German and hasn't been translated into English yet, but hopefully there's some critical theorists out there who might be able to read German and would actually take this seriously and engage with that scholarship. And so the relationship to Brecht is also important because Brecht did also advocate for quite a revolutionary position, was highly critical of the Frankfurt School. He referred to them as twee, because they were intellectuals who got everything backwards because they were in the pay of the capitalist class, and wrote this great satire based partially on Turandot. So Turandot, or the Whitewashers Congress, is the name of the play, which I highly recommend to everyone, because Brecht can bring together political trenchancy with class analysis, with wit and humor and biting irony, and he's quite the force, I think, within the aesthetic world. And also decided to go back to East Germany, right, in the wake of World War II, because he was exiled as well, Denmark, and then in the United States, and subjected to the HUAC interrogation and whatnot, and contributed to building up the theatrical apparatus within East Germany. And so that is also a very interesting, juxtaposition, because we've been focusing to a certain extent on some of the left anti-communists and what they ended up doing, but people in very similar situations, right? These are German intellectuals, cultural producers, many of them Jewish, who were seeking exile when the Nazis rose to power. And what did they do? What were their subjective decisions that they made? And some of Benjamin's decisions and Brecht's decisions were markedly different than those of Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse and some of the others. And so it's important to be able to see that. There's an objective conjuncture, and within that, subjects take different positions, and we have to be able to identify them, call them out for them, and also be able to engage in critique and say, yeah, that is a horrible thing that they did. And it doesn't matter if you're an Adorno scholar or if you have a vested interest in because you did an Adorno translation or other such things. At a human level, regardless of your career, regardless of what, you know, opportunist investments you might have in propping up the franchise, this is a horrible thing to do to a human being. And so anyway, there's more that could be said about this, but maybe the last thing that I would say, because I've done a lot of work on aesthetics and culture, and I'm working on a book with Jennifer Ponce de Leon on aesthetics, is that just as we were saying earlier, that institution building is extremely important for the collective endeavor of political education, bringing people into the struggle. Cultural warfare is crucial, and they do it to us all the time. That's what Netflix is. That's what Hollywood is. That's what mainstream music is. Like, they're constantly bombarding us with the Kool-Aid. And so we've got to leverage power for a cultural message that is the message of Boots Riley, is the message of those who are really doing the work, like Brecht and others, that is making people become much more aware of the world that they're living in, identify how class struggle operates, situate themselves in it, and get plugged into the struggle. And culture, you know, honestly, in thinking back about my own existential experience, culture has been a big part of that, you know. Musical concerts or certain scenes, and, you know, they bring you in, they bring young people in, and you feel like, I want to hang out with these people because they got something going on, you know.
That's wonderfully said. Thank you so much, Professor Rockhill, for being with us. It's been honestly a pleasure and very insightful discussion. Is there anything you'd like to plug before we close out? I would personally recommend everyone to check out your articles. We're going to link the both the one that you recently published, but the ones on Foucault as well. We weren't able to talk much about it. Mitch had a funny question on Foucault that's unfortunate we didn't get there. But the Foucault one and the reply to the criticisms and the comments made on the Foucault one is also a couple of great articles. We'll link those to the YouTube description. But is there anything you'd like to plug before we go?
No, not particularly. I mean, as far as my own work is concerned, if people find it helpful, I'm thrilled. So maybe I'll just plug the institutions, the parties, the organizations that are doing great work. The People's Summit, some of the great parties that are operative in the United States. Give a shout out to the People's Forum in New York City that's doing great work. Yeah, I think it's important for us to all plug one another and the important work that we're doing. And so thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. I've been a fan for a long time. And so hopefully we'll have other opportunities to collaborate and continue to struggle together. And if we want to talk about Foucault at some other time, I'd be happy to do so.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on, comrade.
Yeah,
We would
so
love to
much,
have you
brother.
back
Thank you.
on. This was a great conversation, so we'd definitely love to have you back again to talk more.
Absolutely. Well, take care, everyone. Thanks for all of those who sticked around to watch. And for those that are watching the recording, thank you all. And again, thank you, Professor Rockhill. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.